Fox News Alerts. I'm Shannon Bremen for Bret Baier. The U.S. is imposing new sanctions on Russia, but it's not for what you think. The new penalties are not retaliation for election interference. They are for Russia's alleged attempt to kill a former spy and his daughter with a nerve agent earlier this year in Britain. The two survived. Now, whether U.S.-Russia relations will do the same and in what condition is yet to be determined. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts joins us right now. Good evening, John.
Shannon, good evening to you. President Trump has repeatedly claimed that he has been tough on Russia. Today, bound by international law, the U.S. just got a little tougher. It was back on March 4th that former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were poisoned by a Russian nerve agent found near death on a park bench in Salisbury, England. Later that month, Congress asked the White House to make a determination whether the attack violated international conventions on chemical and biological weapons. Today, the State Department announced the government of the Russian Federation has used chemical or biological weapons in violation of international law or has used lethal chemical or biological weapons against its own nationals. The White House had already kicked 60 Russian diplomats out of the U.S. in response to the attack, but the determination that Russia violated the law triggers new sanctions set to take effect August 22nd. The first round of sanctions limits exports and financing. A second round bans the export of sensitive national security products to Russia. Congress had accused the White House of dragging its feet in making a determination whether there was a violation of law, but the White House is now finally taking action. The president also wants the Russia investigation off the table as quickly as possible. Today, his legal team set a response to special counsel Robert Mueller's parameters for an interview. In a statement, attorney Rudy Giuliani saying millions of pages of documents, along with testimony from dozens of witnesses, have been provided. We're restating what we have been saying for months. It is time for the Office of Special Counsel to conclude its inquiry without further delay. While Giuliani would not provide any detail of the response, he told Fox News it's not a refusal, but at the same time, it's not a completely unreasonable position. I can see a way in which Mueller, may agree with it. Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz thinks the strategy is to make it impossible for Mueller to accept the president's terms.
They're going to make Mueller an offer he can't accept. And in the end, Mueller will say, look, I can't accept this offer, so we're going to subpoena you. The president will be able to say, look, I wanted to testify. It was Mueller who turned me down.
Giuliani told Fox News the ball is now in Mueller's court. How much does he really want an interview, and to what degree does he realize this may be his last chance to get one? That said, Giuliani acknowledges the ultimate decision whether to do it is up to the president.
It's his decision, both as an individual and as the president. It's his decision on how far he wants to go in giving up certain prerogatives.
While the response letter declined Mueller's parameters for an interview, it did not outrightly reject the chance that Mueller might get to sit down with the president. In fact, Giuliani told me late this afternoon there is a way that he can question him. Shannon?
All right. John Roberts live at the White House. Thank you. The White House is denying that President Trump asked Kentucky Senator Rand Paul to deliver a note to Russian leader Vladimir Putin during a trip to Moscow. Fox News is told Trump's letter to Putin was simply an introduction for Paul. The senator is part of a delegation visiting Russia this week. He's been invited by members of Russia's parliament to talk about foreign affairs in Washington. It could be several days before we know the final results from a special election in Ohio and the Republican gubernatorial primary in Kansas. But we are getting a look at the Trump effect, how the president is putting his stamp on the midterm elections. Correspondent Kristen Fisher is in Columbus, Ohio, with the race that came down to the wire and then some. Still counting. Good evening, Kristen.
It sure did, Shannon. This race is still too close to call, but that hasn't stopped President Trump and the Republican candidate Troy Balderson from declaring victory. Do you believe that you've won this race?
Yes, we're confident that we've won this race. The numbers are going our direction, and mathematically, we are going to win this race.
Right now, Balderson's ahead by just 1,700 votes, but there are about 8,000 provisional votes that still need to be counted.
Can you believe how close this is? We are in a tie ball game.
For Democrat Danny O'Connor, to be in a race this tight in a district no Democrat has won in 38 years, that had him delivering what sure sounded like a victory speech last night.
Or you believed in us in a race that the pundits said we had no chance even being in. You proved them wrong.
But getting close won't be enough to help Democrats retake the House this November. They've come close in 4 other special elections in reliably red districts, but they've only won 1. They're banking on a blue wave of anti-Trump energy. But many Republicans see the president as the ultimate energizer for bringing out their base. Do you believe that President Trump's support is the reason that you won?
I don't believe it's the full reason I won, but it's definitely very helpful. I mean, I was honored and humbled to have the president come in here in Delaware County, where our numbers really surged.
President Trump came in, he did a rally in Delaware County, which was the key county last night, and it put Troy Balderson over the edge, and we won last night in that all-important district.
And it wasn't just Ohio. Last night, President Trump may have also proved to be a difference maker in Kansas and Michigan.
The president really took a leading effort in getting the word out, helping us get the vote out.
Iraq War vet John James defeated Sandy Pensler in the Republican Senate primary in Michigan. He now faces Democrat incumbent Senator Debbie Stabenow in the general. And in Kansas, the state Secretary of State Chris Kobach squeaked ahead of incumbent Jeff Collier in the gubernatorial primary after an 11th-hour endorsement from President Trump. This race is also still too close to call, but Kobach says with 90 days to go until the general, he can't afford to stop campaigning.
It is imperative that we begin running, understanding that this is a tentative victory and that I am carrying the baton for this first week with the full knowledge that I may hand the baton to Jeff if the provisional ballots change the outcome.
But President Trump is confident that, quote, as long as I campaign and or support Senate and House candidates within reason, they will win. And just because he's a kingmaker in the primaries, that doesn't mean he'll be able to have the same effect in the general. And that, Shannon, is exactly 90 days away. Shannon?
It's going to fly by. Kristen Fisher in Ohio, thank you. More volleys tonight in the trade war between the world's biggest trading partners. China is slapping new tariffs on American imports in retaliation for new U.S. penalties on Chinese goods. Let's talk about where all of this is going. Deirdre Bolton of Fox Business Network joins us from New York. Good evening, Deirdre.
Good evening, Shannon. The trade dispute between the U.S. and China is escalating. So China slapping additional tariffs on 25% on $16 billion worth of U.S. imports. So Chinese businesses and consumers, they're going to have to pay more for all of the American products. There's 279 of them on this list, from American fuel to American steel to U.S.-made autos to U.S.-manufactured medical equipment. Now, China's moves coming after the Trump administration said it is preparing to put $16 billion of tariffs on Chinese goods in the next 2 weeks. The U.S. has imposed tariffs twice on China in the past month. And Beijing, for its part, it's always said it's going to answer the U.S. in a dollar-for-dollar way. So as the 2 largest economies in the world, the U.S. and China have the largest trading relationship in the world. But as of today, it looks as if neither side plans on backing off. The Office of the United States Trade Representative is reviewing the possibility of putting 10% tariffs on a further $200 billion in Chinese imports, even considering raising that to 25%. President Trump suggesting the U.S. may tax all Chinese goods in the future. Now, as far as business reactions, some American industry representatives, they are voicing concern that trade tensions will raise business costs and eventually consumer prices. In fact, you do have some CEOs who have already increased prices, citing higher materials costs due to tariffs. So Coca-Cola, Boston Beer Company, brewer of Sam Adams are 2 examples of that. Other business leaders on the other side, they approve of the Trump administration's hard line, especially in response to intellectual property theft. The USTR found that Chinese theft of American IP cost the country between $225 and $600 billion annually. Other trade hawks, they say the U.S. can afford to push for more tariffs against China because the U.S. is coming from a stronger place. Americans consume about 80% of what its markets produce, so it makes the U.S. economy more contained than China's. Some strategists say if push comes to shove, the U.S. would weather a trade war better. Shannon, in the meantime, back to you.
All right, Deirdre Bolton in New York.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Sure. A mixed day on Wall Street. The Dow lost 45. The S&P 500 was down a fraction. NASDAQ gained 5. A Republican congressman from New York State is facing federal insider trading charges tonight. Chris Collins is denying the accusations and will speak to the media in just a few minutes. Correspondent Brian Yennis has the story breaking tonight from New York. Good evening, Brian.
Good evening, Shannon. Congressman Chris Collins pled not guilty to federal charges of lying to the FBI and of insider trading. His bail was set at $500,000 and he was forced to hand over his diplomatic passport. The congressman's son and his son's fiance's father also pled not guilty to charges. According to federal prosecutors, Collins was a member of the board of directors of an Australian biotech company called Innate Immunotherapeutics. He was also its largest shareholder. The indictment charges that during a congressional picnic last summer at the White House, he received an email from the CEO of the company informing him that a multiple sclerosis drug failed its drug trials. Within minutes, Collins informed his son, who alerted others. They all sold their stock in the company. 5 days later, news of the drug trial failure went public. The stock plummeted 92%, but by then Collins's friends and family had been spared some $800,000 in losses.
Congressman Collins had an obligation, a legal duty, to keep that information secret until that information was released by the company to the public. But he didn't keep it secret. Instead, as alleged, he decided to commit a crime. He placed his family and friends above the public good.
In a statement, Collins' lawyer says, quote, "It is notable that even the government does not allege that Congressman Collins traded a single share of Innate Therapeutics stock. We are confident he will be absolutely vindicated and exonerated." But prosecutors contend the reason why Congressman Collins never sold any of his stock was because at the same time he was under investigation by the Congressional Ethics Office for insider trading or for an inappropriate relationship with this very company. Actually, that investigation ended up finding out that there was, quote, substantial evidence to suggest that this congressman was using his power improperly to try to forward this biotech company to try to help them. Ultimately, though, Collins is holding a press conference within the hour. The House Speaker, Paul Ryan, is demanding a House Ethics Committee investigation be opened on Congressman Chris Collins. Shannon.
Brian Yennis in New York, thank you. And we will keep an eye out for that presser and bring folks news as that happens. Well, the former chairman of the Trump presidential campaign is officially the one on trial this month in Virginia. It is the prosecutor's star witness who was under intense attack during today's proceedings. Correspondent Peter Ducey is live again tonight in Alexandria. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Shannon. Paul Manafort's trial came to a screeching halt earlier today because, as part of the Manafort defense team's effort to discredit the special counsel's star witness, Rick Gates, Manafort lawyers asked Gates if he told government lawyers during 20-plus hours of prep for the stand that he had an extramarital affair. Gates said yes. But then Manafort's lawyer asked if he ever told the government he had 4 extramarital affairs. And before Gates could answer, the Mueller team objected, and after a long conference at the bench, the parties moved on. But Gates was reminded by the Mueller team today that they haven't promised him a light sentence in exchange for his cooperation, and that if the government finds out Gates is lying about anything, they will rip up their plea agreement and he will face charges that could send him to jail for more than 100 years. The Manafort defense team also argued today that the feds didn't have a problem with his books 4 years ago because they got Gates on the record about a 2014 FBI interview that he and Paul Manafort voluntarily appeared for to help the Bureau with an investigation into a Manafort client, the former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Gates testified he told agents then about bank accounts in Cyprus, now at the center of fraud charges against Manafort. He also told agents then that accounts in Cyprus were the way the two of them got paid for consulting work in Ukraine. And he told the court today at the time, Paul Manafort said, be open with the FBI. But the Mueller team got Gates to admit he didn't tell agents then about hidden income in those accounts, and he never forked over tax returns, and there were no IRS agents present. Judge T.S. Ellis continued today trying to speed up the trial and continued trying to assert his control over the proceedings, telling both sides that judges should be patient. They made a mistake when they confirmed me. I am not patient. So, the star witness, Rick Gates, is done, but just a few minutes ago, the Mueller team announced they have 8 more witnesses left to call in this case before they rest. Shannon?
We'll see how that goes over with the judge. Peter Ducey, thank you very much. Up next, we'll tell you why one Middle Eastern nation is really upset with our neighbors to the north. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 2 in Detroit. As Ford Motor Company rolls off the assembly line, its 10 millionth Mustang. Vehicles from across the decades gathered in the parking lot in the Flat Rock assembly plant this morning could see to coordinate a 10 million figure as seen from the sky. The iconic car has been around for 54 years. Fox 5 in San Diego, as a blaze that prompted evacuation orders in 2 Orange County communities continues to scorch thousands of acres in the Cleveland National Forest. As of last night, the flames have burned about 5.5 square miles. The fire was last estimated to be 5% contained. And this is a live look at Chicago from Fox 32. The big story there tonight, Chicago officials say hundreds of additional police officers will be deployed to city neighborhoods where a burst of gun violence over the weekend left at least 11 people dead and about 70 wounded. The police superintendent says 400 additional officers are already patrolling areas on the west and south sides where most of the shootings occurred. Another 200 will be added by the coming weekend. That is tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. A judge in Texas is hearing arguments in which that state and several others contend the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program is unlawful. DACA shields many immigrants who were brought to the U.S. illegally as children from deportation. 3 other federal judges have ruled against the Trump administration's attempt to get rid of DACA. So if this judge rules that DACA should end, it would create a conflict between legal rulings that could put the issue on the fast track to the U.S. Supreme Court. Saudi Arabia is really angry at Canada. The kingdom is continuing its diplomatic outburst against our northern neighbors tonight. Correspondent David Lee Miller in our Middle East Bureau explains what's going on.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is not backing down on his country's criticism of Saudi Arabia's human rights policy, despite escalating tension between the two countries.
Canadians have always expected our government to speak strongly, firmly, clearly, and politely about the need to respect human rights at home and around the world. We will continue to do this.
On Monday, a Saudi newscaster delivered his country's first salvo in the dispute. He said the kingdom would not tolerate Canadian meddling in Saudi sovereignty and was expelling the Canadian ambassador. All new Saudi investments in Canada were halted. The Saudis were responding to an earlier tweet from Canada's foreign minister, criticizing the treatment of 2 Saudi women's rights activists, blogger Raif Badawi, who is married to a Canadian citizen, and his sister, Samar. The foreign minister tweeted, quote, "Very alarmed to learn that Samar Badawi, Raif Badawi's sister, has been imprisoned in Saudi Arabia. Canada stands together with the Badawi family in this difficult time, and we continue to call for the release of both Raif and Samar Badawi." The kingdom is reportedly selling off Canadian stocks and other assets, stopped government payment for Saudi patients being treated in Canadian hospitals, and ended Saudi air service to Toronto. Some 8,000 Saudi students studying in Canada will lose their government-funded scholarships. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister defended his country's actions.
We think what Canada did is unacceptable. We do not discuss Canada's internal affairs, and we do not try to impose our values and principles on any other country.
Canada plans to ask other countries to help resolve the dispute in what some see as a shift in U.S. human rights policy. A State Department spokeswoman says Washington will not get involved. Shannon?
David Lee Miller in our Middle East Bureau. Thank you. Authorities say the father of a missing Georgia boy was training children at his compound in New Mexico to commit school shootings. They say it happened at a facility where 11 children were discovered in pretty bad shape. National correspondent William Lajeunesse has the latest from our West Coast newsroom. Hello, William.
Well, Shannon, police found the children ages 1 to 15 last week hungry and malnourished, living in squalor in a compound in rural New Mexico. They also found an AR-15 rifle, 5 30-round loaded magazines, and 4 loaded pistols. Now, according to court records filed today, these 5 defendants, 2 men, 3 women, trained at least one of the children to use a gun. Quoting, a foster parent of one of the 11 children stated the defendant had trained the child in the use of an assault rifle in preparation for future school shootings. Additionally, the DA accused the 3 women of transporting children across state lines for the purpose of receiving advanced weapons training to commit future acts of violence. Now, police searched the compound last week after receiving a text saying, quote, "We are starving, need food and water." And after seeing a shooting range on the property, a SWAT team moved in unannounced and arrested the 5.
For me, that was the breaking point where I thought we finally had enough probable cause to put in an affidavit for a search warrant and present it to a district judge.
Now, they were looking for this boy, 3-year-old Abdul Wahab, kidnapped last year by his father, Siraj. Now, the father believed the boy was possessed by the devil and planned to perform an exorcism. In fact, the child could not walk because of epilepsy. Now, Wahab's father is a controversial Islamic cleric who was named but never charged as an unindicted co-conspirator in the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. He also praised the man who was convicted in that bombing and called the CIA and FBI, quote, the real terrorists. Now, 2 of the children who are now in state care have told police that young boy Abdul, he died and is buried at the compound in a tunnel. Monday, police found what they believe to be his remains, but that has not been confirmed by the coroner. Shannon, the 5 defendants appeared in court in the last 2 hours on child abuse charges and all have asked for a public defender. Back to you.
Shocking information there. William, thank you. Up next, is socialism going to take over the Democratic Party? But first, beyond our borders tonight, aid is now reaching isolated areas of the Indonesian island of Lombok after a powerful earthquake Sunday. Rescuers intensified efforts today to find those buried in the rubble. The National Disaster Agency is standing by its latest death toll of 131, despite other government agencies, including the military, reporting much higher figures. A United Nations aid agency is calling on Israel to allow emergency fuel into the Gaza Strip to avert the shutdown of hospitals and sanitation facilities. Israel halted the supply of petroleum and natural gas to Gaza last week in response to incendiary kites and balloons launched from Gaza into southern Israel. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is accusing two opposition legislators of having roles in the drone explosions that officials have called an assassination attempt. At least one lawmaker is among those detained. Maduro says some of the 6 suspects arrested have already implicated key financiers and others. Maduro's opponents say the incident was staged to justify persecution of his enemies. Just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back.
The socialism has been enjoying a moment ever since Bernie Sanders galvanized millions of supporters in 2016. The wider Democratic Party may not be ready to fully embrace the movement. Whitmer beat out 2 more liberal newcomers, an Indian-American businessman and a Muslim-American doctor endorsed by Sanders. She ran a campaign that relied on traditional fundraising and highlighted her position in the party establishment. Moderate candidates bested their left-leaning opponents in a whole host of key races, from Missouri to Michigan, Washington to Kansas. Though backers of a more diverse party did have reason to cheer in Kansas, where gay Native American congressional candidate Sharice Davids beat out 5 opponents, one who worked for Bernie Sanders. But amid perceived divisions, the party line's clear.
There are a lot of different issue areas and a lot of different ways to achieve different policy goals, but when it comes to the end of the day, Democrats want to win in 2018.
The fight for the soul of the Democratic Party isn't only about ideology. Democrats of all stripes have to contend with the bottom line in the run-up to November. And a new study finds the math is a real challenge for socialists. Fulfilling their core promises of single-payer health care, free college, and guaranteed employment would tally up to a cost of $42 trillion over the next 10 years. That's 40% of GDP, according to a study by the right-leaning Manhattan Institute.
There's going to be a healthy debate in leading up to 2020 in the primary between probably a whole lot of Democrats. If Donald Trump is part of that, then, so be it.
Debate within the Democratic Party will continue through the fall. Between now and the midterms, 11 more states will host primaries that pit candidates from the left and centrist wings of the party against one another. Tomorrow, newcomer and Sanders-endorsed congressional candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez goes to bat for a fellow member of the Democratic Socialists of America in Hawaii. This in advance of that state's primary on Saturday. Shannon?
All right. Jillian Turner, thank you.
You're welcome.
Missouri voters have rejected a right-to-work law that would have prevented private sector unions from collecting compulsory fees from workers who don't join. The law was defeated by a 2-to-1 margin after unions secured a referendum on the measure, which was signed into law last year. Back here at home, top Pentagon officials are warning the Russian Navy is operating at levels not seen since the Cold War, forcing the U.S. military to take action. The news comes as President Trump has signaled a willingness to improve relations with the longtime adversary. Lucas Tomlinson reports from the Pentagon.
2 months before the Helsinki summit, a Russian ballistic missile submarine test-fired 4 long-range missiles in rapid succession off the Russian coast, some 4,500 miles from Washington, D.C., well within their 6,000-mile range. And U.S. spy satellites took note. The U.S. Navy's top admiral said this week Russia's submarine activity in the North Atlantic is, quote, more than we've seen in 25 years. And observers say Moscow is sending a message.
I think Russia is signaling to us that the bear is back. And we're likely to see more of this sort of intimidating, threatening operations on the part of the Russian fleet.
U.S. officials are concerned special Russian submarines can tap into undersea cables. But Defense Secretary Jim Mattis this week downplayed the Russian Navy threat.
We always keep an eye on the submarines at sea. And I'd prefer not to say any more than that.
Since Russian forces deployed to Syria 3 years ago, Russian submarines in the Mediterranean have launched missiles to help crush the rebellion battling the Assad regime. And the show of their submarine force is an extension of Russia's larger strategy. Russia's naval display isn't limited to submarines. Last night, the British Royal Navy dispatched a guided missile destroyer to escort 2 Russian warships through the English Channel. The British now keep a warship on 24-hour alert. And the U.S. is following suit. The U.S. Navy is bringing back the Second Fleet later this month in Norfolk, Virginia, to keep tabs on the Russians in the Atlantic. It had been deactivated in 2011. The two sides seem to be taking a page out of their Cold War playbooks, despite the Trump-Putin summit and the president saying he hopes the U.S. and Russia will get along. Shannon?
Lucas Tomlinson at the Pentagon, thank you. So what did we learn last night about the Democratic Socialist prospects in the midterms? We'll break it down with the panel when we come back. Within a percentage, they could have a recount. Our Capitol Hill producer, Chad Pergham, says no one could be sworn in before September 4th. These guys are running against each other again for November, Charlie.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. But I do think that the important things to sort of take away from this are it was, for Republicans, it was a whole lot closer than it should have been, without a doubt. But I also think the fact that it's a special election. It's in August, where nobody's paying attention anyway. People
are at Disney World.
Exactly, they're at the beach. So it's sort of hard to sort of try to read too much into it. But you did have higher than expected turnout for something like this, and the fact that it wasn't that higher turnout clearly included not just Democrats but also Republicans turned out at a higher rate. It sort of, to me, suggests that maybe this blue wave, while conditions are absolutely in Democrats' favor, and Republicans should be very worried period right now and working hard. I don't really see evidence of a blue tidal wave forming right now.
Okay, so let's put up the board so we can look at where we are right now. Troy Balderson, the Republican in this district, at 50.2 percentage points. Danny O'Connor, the Democrat, 49.3%. They're within a percentage point there, Mara. And we know that there are some 8,000 potential votes in flux here.
Right. It kind of doesn't matter who wins by a hair in this election. What matters is what this tells us or doesn't tell us about November. One of the things it tells us, it's following the trend we've seen all year. Democrats overperformed more than Republicans did. In other words, their turnout was higher than 2014 and 2016 than the Republicans were. Once again, we saw Republicans have a lot of resources, money. They had the president able to come into the district. But they're not going to be able to do that in the close to 70 races that are less Republican. There are 70 districts that are less Republican than that one. So that's the House battleground, and the Democrats have a shot at taking the House back.
Well, here's what the president said. He tweeted, "As long as I campaign and or support Senate and House candidates," he says within reason. We could debate that. "They will win!" Exclamation point. "I love the people, and they certainly seem to like the job I'm doing if I find the time. In between China, Iran, the economy, and much more, which I must, we will have a giant red wave." The English part of me wants to start diagramming all of those sentences. There's a lot of meat in there. But Jonathan, he says, listen, when I show up, and he said this in a tweet about Balderson last night, I showed up and flipped this race and help him win. He can't go to 70 places. Maybe he could. He says he wants to, be out there 5-6 days a week.
So he wants to be out there 6 or 7 days a week. Yeah. My understanding is the Secret Service, the most they can deal with is probably 4 days a week. That's still a lot. They're planning at the moment to do more campaigning for this president than either Barack Obama or George W. Bush. He wants to be out there. He wants to be going all around the country. There are districts where he'll be helpful. There is no question. I haven't spoken to a single person involved in the race last night who doesn't think the president had an effect. Of course he did. He came in and energized the base. But there's actually a lot of districts around the country with vulnerable members who want the president nowhere near their district. There's, I could name you a list, but you could just pick one. Carlos Cabello in Florida. He has told the White House political operation, this is not something I want.
Certain districts, if you've got hot topics like immigration and those kinds of things, it's not going to be beneficial to him there.
A district like this is heavily Republican. That's where he can be useful. But in those other suburban districts, especially the ones that Hillary Clinton won, probably not a good idea.
And last night when you talked to the people analysing this race who've worked on it, it didn't tell them anything they didn't know. They were already concerned. They remain concerned. And the problems that they thought existed still exist.
So let's talk about another race. It's even closer. This was the GOP primary in the Kansas governor's race. The president, the man he endorsed, Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who has had plenty of controversies but seems to enjoy that as much as the president does, by 1/10 of a percentage point over the current governor who stepped in to fill the slot with Sam Brownback, Jeff Collier. That's going to be a tight one, too. But again, Charlie, does the president make the difference there?
Well, clearly, I think the reason that Kobach was in the race at all is because of the late endorsement by the president. And in a lot of ways, I thought that was a little bit more a more interesting race, just because I think it does reveal that Donald Trump he's putting his mark on the party by getting involved in these inter-party fights, he clearly believed in Chris Kobach because they agree on key issues like immigration, illegal immigration, and tightening voter rules, when a president like Trump does that, he really is starting to remake the party more in his ilk.
I want to make sure that we talk about some of the candidates on the progressive left that were endorsed and got visits from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Bernie Sanders. This is what they're talking about when they say Democratic Socialists, their agenda: Medicare for all, free college proposal, guaranteed jobs at $15 an hour plus benefits, Social Security expansion, up to 12 weeks of paid family leave for new parents and people with serious health conditions, $1 trillion for new infrastructure, paying off all $1.4 trillion in student loan debt. Now, according to the Manhattan Institute study, they put the price tag at this: $42.5 trillion over the next decade. That's on top of the $12.4 trillion baseline deficit, but $218 trillion over the next 30 years. maybe reality struck for some of those folks last night, Mara, when they had to
some
think.
of them won their primaries, we'd be testing those, but they didn't. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have a really good record at getting press coverage for the candidates they endorse. They have a much poorer record at actually getting some of these candidates over the finish line. And in a lot of these races where they endorsed the candidate, they lost by big, big margins.
And we saw a number of Democrats run to the center, as we saw in the Conor Lamb case in Pennsylvania, and it seemed that those who were running away from the progressive agenda did better for the most part last night.
Well, the country of the United States of America hasn't become a socialist country, you know, overnight, and nor will it. It's probably a centre-right country, so that model of just taking democratic socialism and slapping it around the country is not going to be replicable for everyone. But I will say we often over-interpret everything, so I still think it's where the energy is in the Democratic Party, and I still think you look at that crop of 2020 candidates, their agenda is going to look much closer to Bernie Sanders and Alexandria than it will to Conor Lamb or some centrist
We've got to add abolish
agenda.
ICE. Abolish ICE has to go on the list, too. All right. Thanks very much. Stick around, panel. Up next, why is Saudi Arabia so mad at Canada?
The answer to that. I will say, if people expect that President Trump will back off or look for an exit ramp, I don't think they've paid very close attention to him in these trade situations. The Chinese keep escalating, he keeps escalating. The difference is Trump has to respond to domestic political pressure, including elections in November. President Xi is an autocrat who has no internal, he can stifle internal dissent, and it's an economy run by the state. So he has a lot more. I hear what Larry Kudlow is saying there, but I also think that you have another side which has a lot of political tools that aren't available to Donald Trump.
Well, and Mara, I mean, there was a push in the Senate, obviously, before they all took off for the recess, to find ways to tie the president's hands on some of these tariff decisions.
Right, especially ones which he would invoke using national security, like the threatened auto tariffs, which I'm told will probably never happen. But what Larry Kudlow was just talking about was trade balances. That's something that the Chinese could do something about, just like the EU came over and said, we'll buy a bunch more soybeans, and Donald Trump seemed to like that. But what the Trump administration wants China to do is change its whole business model. It wants to stop it from stealing technology, intellectual property theft. They don't like the fact that they're subsidizing all these industries of the future. That's going to be a lot harder to accomplish.
I want to make sure, too, that we talk about, we have a couple more international hotspots, but let's talk about this dispute between Canada and Saudi Arabia. The Canadians speaking out on the detention of some dissidents there in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia saying, stay out of our internal business, and now lashing back at Canada. Here's a little bit from both sides.
We continue to engage diplomatically and politically with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We have respect for their importance in the world and recognize that they have made progress on a number of important issues, but we will at the same time continue to speak clearly and firmly on issues of human rights.
We do not accept being told what to do, and we do not accept for a country to interfere in our internal affairs, just as we do not interfere in any country's internal affairs. We think that what Canada did is unacceptable. We do not discuss Canada's internal affairs, and we do not try to impose our values and principles on any country, and we are open for a dialogue with any country.
So, Charlie, Saudi Arabia has expelled the Canadian ambassador. They've frozen educational and medical issues and any new investments. They're really pushing back hard.
Yeah, I think it's great that that Canada, or I think it's great that for any of the countries to call out places like Saudi Arabia for human rights abuses. It would be great if the world had a more unified rejection of a place like Iran, which has at least as many of the same human rights abuses. But as long as it stops short of us becoming, policemen of the world, that's what I think that's what I think people are really sick and tired of. But to go back to the thing about the trade.
because they're making the case the president has vast executive power to.
Finally tonight, two brothers united with their father's legacy through a dog tag. Among the remains of American service members, North Korea returned to the U.S. last week. Army Master Sergeant Charles McDaniel was serving as a medic in North Korea when his unit came under attack in 1950. Today, his sons, who were just 2 and 3 years old when he deployed, were handed a memory.
We're just overwhelmed. I am, that of all of these boxes that came back, and out of all of these thousands of people that are